Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, Maths Made Easy with Terry in 10 minutes. Okay, so we're going to be starting this series on quadratic equations. So we're going to be talking about quadratic equations and maybe inequalities. I can just throw in inequalities here as well. So we're going to talk about how do we solve quadratic equation, how do we completing the square, discriminant, finding the roots, and the rest of it. All right, so like I always say, don't forget to subscribe so that when you upload new videos, you'll be the first person to know, and you also get notification when I upload new videos. Okay, so generally in algebra, a quadratic equation is any equation that can be rearranged in a standard form. So a quadratic equation is an equation that can be rearranged like this: ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So any form of any equation that can be written like this, where the power of x is 2 and above, that's a quadratic equation. So that means where x is equal to an unknown value. So that's basically what we are looking for. Is that okay? An unknown value. And A, B, and C, okay, are known. So A, B, and C are known values. So for example, if we have something like 5x squared plus 3x minus 4 equal to 0. This is a quadratic equation. As you can see, A is 5, B is 3, and C is minus 4. But one thing you need to note is that A can never be 0, okay? Because when A is 0, it's now a linear equation. So it's possible to have missing B and C. So that means you can have something like 3x minus 4. This is now a linear equation, okay? So it's possible to have 5x squared minus 4. This is still a quadratic equation, okay? But A can never be 0. So let me just write it down. So for some of you that are writing, so you can also take note of that in your notebook. All right, so we're gonna have this now. So just to note, okay, that if A is 0, okay, if A is 0, that means 0. So if you solve and you get A to be 0, then it's a linear equation. Then it is a linear what? Equation. So that means A can never be what? 0. But it's also possible to have missing A, B, or C terms, okay? So it is possible to have, okay, missing B or C terms, okay? But never, okay? But never A. So it's possible to have missing B or C terms. So usually, so therefore we call A, this A is referred to as the quadratic coefficient. So that's why you can never have it to be 0, okay? So the A is called the quadratic coefficient. Then the B is always referred to as the linear coefficient, okay? The B is the linear coefficient. And the C is what we call the constant, or you can call it the free term, or you can call it the constant, all right? So you call it the constant, or some textbook we call it the constant coefficient, okay? Some textbook, if you check some of them, they will call it the free term, all right? So they're all the same thing. So that means you can have things like, for example, you can have 5x squared minus 4. This is still a quadratic equation. You can have 5x squared minus 3x. This is still a quadratic equation, but you can never have 3x minus 4 like this. This is just a linear equation. So these two are quadratic equation. This is not a quadratic what? Equation. So the values of x, so that satisfy this. So when you solve this, like for instance, you solve 5x squared minus 4, and the values of x that satisfy this, we always call it the root. Some textbook will call it the solution of the equation. Okay. So when you solve and you get the x, sometimes it's called the root, sometimes it's called the solution, okay? So sometimes it's called the root, sometimes it's called the zeros, okay? All right? The zeros of the expression or the equation, all right? Then in some cases, when you solve, sometimes it's being called the x-intercept. So these are several names that the solution can come in, all right? So these are several names that the solution can come in. So these are for the values of x that satisfy it. Is that okay? So that satisfy the equation. So you can hear different names. You can hear something like the solution of the equation. You can hear things like the roots, all right? You can hear things like the zeros of the equation. You can hear things like the x-intercept. So regardless, it has different names. So what we're going to talk about in this series now, before I start any series, I prefer to list out what we're going to talk about throughout the whole series so that we can prepare ourselves, and also you can skip. So for instance, if I want to have a quick revision on completing the square, I'm going to skip to the video that has completing the square in the series. Is that okay? So the first thing I'm going to start with, so remember I always say I assume no knowledge, so I'm going to start from the scratch. So the topics we're going to talk about, I'm going to first start with how do you expand, okay? Quadratic expressions. So how do you expand quadratic expressions? So I'm going to start with that. Then when I'm done with that, then I'm going to show you how to solve quadratic equations, okay? So number 2, we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations. So like I told you, some textbook, we call it finding the roots, okay? So we can call it finding its roots or the roots of the equations. Some will say finding the x-intercept. Some can say finding the zeros of the equation. So all of them are the same thing, all right? So under this part, I'm going to talk about how do we use the quadratic formula. Okay, we'll talk about the quadratic formulas. So how do we use quadratic formulas? Then I'm going to also explain the concept of factorization method. Okay, I'll talk about the factorization method. Now, under factorization method, we have 4 types. I'll talk about the concept of common factors. How do you use the common factors? I also talk about the concept of the difference of 2 squares. So I'll talk about the difference of 2 squares. Okay, so I'll explain that. I also talk about trinomials when a is equal to 1. So we'll talk about trinomials when a is equal to 1. So that means I'm referring to the a. So this a here. So when the a value we have here is equal to 1, how do you factorize? And also I'm going to talk about trinomials when a is not equal to 1. So you have any other number except 1. So it's usually referred to as the Wendy's way, okay? Or the Wendy's method. I'm going to talk about how do you solve that. All right? Then when I'm done with the factorization, definitely I'm going to talk about completing the square. All right, so this is one of the most important methods because with this method, you can find the vertex. We talk about that. You can do so many other things. I also use it to sketch the graph. So I'm going to have another video series on how do you find or how do you use the completing the square method to factorize. Is that okay? Or solve, sorry, to solve quadratic equations. Number 3, when I'm done now showing you how to solve quadratic equation, the next thing I'm going to show you is how do you find discriminants. So we're going to talk about finding discriminants. I'm going to show you how to find discriminants, or some textbook can also call it discriminant and nature of the roots. Is that okay? So nature of the root. So that means we're trying to predict what the values will be, or what nature the values will be, whether the values will be equal roots, there'll be distinct roots, or there'll be no solutions, okay? So we're going to talk about that. So the nature of roots of the quadratic equation. So we're going to talk about finding discriminant and the nature of root. Then when we're done with finding discriminant, the next thing I'm going to show you is how do we find vertex, okay? So how do you find vertex? I'm going to talk about vertex very soon. Then when we're done with vertex and I've shown you all this, how to find discriminant, how to find vertex, then we'll do some sketching as well. I'm going to talk about how to sketch some graphs. So I'm going to show you how to sketch. Okay, I'm going to show you how to sketch graphs. So I will start with, we're going to sketch linear graphs. So linear graph. So please, if you've not reviewed my video on linear equation, please go back. All right. So we're going to talk about linear graphs like in the form of y is equal to mx plus c. All right. Usually we talk about linear graphs. Okay. Then also I'm going to show you how to sketch quadratic graphs. So I'm going to show you how to use sketch quadratic graphs as well. So how do you sketch graphs? So remember we said quadratic graphs are ax squared plus bx plus c. And I also talk about what are the major points to know when sketching each of these graphs. Then the next one I'm going to talk about how do you solve quadratic simultaneous equations. All right. So I'm going to talk about how do you solve quadratic simultaneous equations. So these are interesting because this is more of like when you're trying to solve an equations that have a quadratic graph as well as a linear graph or two quadratic graphs. So I'm going to show you how to solve that. Or you can have things like quadratic and linear. Is that okay? So you could have this, or you can also have quadratic and linear simultaneous equation. So we talk about this as well. Linear simultaneous equation. Simultaneous. All right, we'll talk about this. How do you do that? Then when we're done with this, I'm going to then round it up with inequalities. So we're going to talk about the linear and quadratic inequalities. So you can see that we're going to have a very interesting ride this time. Okay, so these are the topics I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to first start with how do you expand quadratic expressions. I will go straight to finding the roots or solving quadratic equation using either the formula. I'll then go to the factorization method and completing the square. Then I'm going to talk about how do you use solve discriminant and nature of roots, as well as finding the vertex. All right. I want you to also keep in mind that you have to review the previous videos, actually some of the basic algebra, because it is important for you to do this. Is that okay? So, and like I said, each of the following videos will be building on the previous one. So it is advisable to go through each of the videos before you go to the next one so that you understand what we are doing. All right. So I'm going to see you in the next video. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about how do you expand. We're going to start with the first one. How do you expand quadratic expressions? So we're going to start with that. And like I said, please don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any question, feel free to send me an email and I will get back to you on it. So I'm going to see you soon. And we'll now talk about the rest of it. So see you soon.